Hello everybody, and welcome to the first in a little series that we're doing here at Saint-Esprit on church architecture. Over the last 2,000 years or so, we're going to be exploring the spirituality of why churches have been built in certain ways. We're going to be exploring the theology and the art, the architecture behind those Christian buildings. But before we look at the development of the styles of Christian buildings through the last 2,000 years or so, we're going to start by asking some pretty general questions about the topic. And first of all, we'll start with some reservations or criticisms that people have had about why we build churches at all. First of all, if God made the universe, isn't everywhere holy? Some people say that they worship God better in nature than they do in a building, actually. But why do we think of certain spaces as more holy than others? On the left, we have Central Park in New York, and on the right, we have the high altar of the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. So the question is God more at home in one place than in another? Where would you fancy worshipping God more? On the left-hand side, perhaps you could worship God alone, but on the right-hand side, certainly you would be worshipping God together with other people, which is what church or ecclesia is all about. Also, Jesus said that the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So why are we making these elaborate and expensive buildings? Surely there are more poor people in the world and victims of war and oppression that could be better served by using the resources that went into the building of churches to relieve their needs. Perhaps by the end of the course, we'll be able to try and answer that very, very difficult question. Thirdly, would we be able to learn about our faith if it wasn't for buildings? Do church buildings teach us something about God that can't actually be learned in any other way? Here you have the west portal of Chartres Cathedral, which is a sermon in stone, and we'll be discovering why when we look at Gothic architecture. So I hope that as we look at the development of church architecture, we're going to be able to answer some of these questions, but I bet we'll have many, many more questions that we want to ask. Firstly, our surroundings have got a profound effect on what we experience. As you can see on the left-hand side, if you walked into that particular space, you would have very, very different feelings than if you walked into the space that you can see on the right. A nice time in store on the right and a potentially unpleasant time in store on the left. So the most basic definition of a sacred space is a place where we feel that our environment, our surroundings, are naturally or consciously actually created in order to put us in the presence of something that's greater than ourselves. Now, this experience of sacred space is common to all human civilizations, and high places in particular have been associated with the home of the gods, and so have caves in the deep places of the earth. So mountains and caves have been endowed with spiritual significance, and people have sought them out as places of religious importance. And in places where there were no mountains, for instance, people constructed high places, built them up. Think here of the Tower of Babel as an example. On the right-hand side, we can see a church in France that's been built on the top of a volcanic plug, a high place that came naturally. Here we can see the ziggurat of Ur, which was constructed around 2100 BC. It was originally a lot higher than this. The base of it here has been reconstructed, but it had various other levels built on top of it in the flat plains of Mesopotamia, with the Holy of Holies, the temple, on the very top of it. Here's a cave, which is often the source of fertilizing rivers, in fact. In the ancient world, they were sometimes thought to be thought of as the mouths of hell, or here, in this case, in a place like Delphi, in the Corcyraean cave, a cave from which the oracle spoke on the top of Mount Parnassus. Something similar here at Lourdes is happening. Here we have the sacred cave in which the Blessed Virgin Mary made an appearance to those 3 children. But it's not just mountains and caves that are sacred and holy to people. Springs of water, groves of trees, or a strangely shaped stone, or a particular unusual feature of the landscape would lead people to think of it as a particularly holy place. On the bottom left here we have Jacob's pillow, the place where Jacob dreamt of the ladder between earth and heaven, waking up saying, surely God was in this place and I didn't know it. People still leave stones there, as you can see on the top of Jacob's pillow. And on the right-hand side, we can see Takebostan in Iran, where a particularly sacred mountain has been carved out into sacred temples here, as you can see. Here's a famous example of it, El Qurn, in the Valley of the Kings in Luxor. We're all familiar with the pyramids in the northern part of Egypt, but here in the southern part of Egypt, near Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, we have a naturally pyramid-shaped mountain, which is exactly why this natural feature of the landscape, which looks like a pyramid, was used to carve out the tombs of the kings of the New Kingdom in Egypt. Now, some people call these spaces thin places where people have sensed that another world is breaking through. Perhaps people have had dreams there, as we just saw in Jacob's pillow, or something very significant has happened to a saint in that place, a martyrdom or a miracle. And very often people will say that when they enter a specifically religious place, they sense the presence of God or even the power of God. Here you can see in Syracuse Cathedral that a sacred space in Syracuse that was used by the Greeks when Sicily was part of the Greek world, they've reused the pillars that were used in the pagan temple in a new temple on the same spot. And here we can see successive uses of the same sacred space once again in Luxor in southern Egypt, where, as you can see on the right-hand side, we have the pylons of the temple dedicated to Amun-Ra by the ancient Egyptians. The same spot was used by the Copts for a Christian church, and now it's the site of a mosque, as we can see here, a sacred space for Islam. Here's another cave for us in Monte Sant'Angelo. The Archangel Michael appeared there to the Bishop of Sipontum. Now, very often people will say that when they enter a space, they sense the presence of God and the power of God, as I've mentioned. But there are actually 3 types of power in a space that's been set aside for worship. We're going to explore them very briefly. Divine power. What is God doing in that place? How do we feel the presence of God in that place? Secondly, there's social power being exercised in that place, power that's related to a variety of hierarchies, both social hierarchies and ordained clerical hierarchies. This is the power that we experience exercised in a place by the power or authority of a priest, a minister, a preacher, or important members of a congregation, as we'll see in a moment. Thirdly, there's a sort of personal power that comes from walking into a sacred space, the feelings that you would get of spiritual empowerment that an individual might find on encountering the divine in a religious building through pilgrimage, through worship, through popping into a church to say a private prayer, for instance, and coming out feeling more calm or more empowered by your encounter in that spiritual space. Here we have an example of how that power is manifested or felt when the place is said to be the residence of God himself. It's God exercising power that touches us. Now, some say that the power is felt there because the site or the building is really the dwelling place of a divinity, that there's a divine substance there. A Hindu temple, for instance, is a building created to house a god, where the god is fed. In ancient Egypt, for instance, the god was clothed or woken up in the morning and made up with facial makeup, for instance, or put to sleep at night. On the right-hand side, you can see the reconstruction of Phidias, a statue of Athena Parthenos in the Parthenon in Athens. Jewish temple of Solomon is also in this category. Here we can see a reconstruction of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark itself contained the tablets of the law and Aaron's rod and a pot of manna, but over the top of that Ark in these seraphim with their outstretched wings was the Shekinah, the presence of God himself, the glory of God that used this Ark as a throne for God's dwelling place. Native American groups also base moral and legal claims to certain lands on this understanding that those particular places have an indwelling spiritual essence within them that can't be desecrated by using them for another purpose or by the government appropriating them for certain other enterprises. This isn't just restricted to the Hindus or the pagans or the ancient Jewish temple. Also, this applies itself to certain Christian denominations as well. That Roman Catholics tend to believe in a real presence within their churches. So here we have the perpetual adoration of Christ thought to be present in the host that's placed here in this monstrance that we can hear, that we can see here on the tabernacle. We saw also in Lourdes that Mary is thought to have a lingering presence in that sacred pilgrimage site in south-western France. Other people believe that the holiness of a place is created by believers who invest it with meaning. In other words, if a place is thought to be holy, believers over the centuries have thought of that place as holy. It's taken on the holiness of those through successive generations who visited it, who've had a spiritual experience there. And in Christianity, this was particularly true of places that were important in the life of Jesus. So people who are a part of a particular religious tradition believe those places to be intrinsically holy, whereas people perhaps who are outside that tradition, that religion, wouldn't necessarily find them quite so numinous. So one question that we can ask ourselves as we work through this series is, when we look at a sacred site of another faith, does it evoke in us similar responses as those we have when we look at our own sacred spaces? Now here is a moquette of the Second Temple in Jerusalem that's going to help us to understand the next way in which we experience holiness in a place. How do these people who come to visit a place or use it as a place of worship turn a precinct, a temple, a place, the word is related to template, in fact, that's a place that has been set aside for a certain purpose. How do people then turn that place that's been set aside into a spiritual place? The first way in which this is done is the way that people are arranged in that space. The areas of a temple or a church are in fact arranged hierarchically along this sort of longitudinal axis that runs from exterior spaces out here, just here, through to the interior rooms until you get into the Holy of Holies, way back here where only the high priest was allowed access. The closer you get to this Holy of Holies, the more holy you are, or the more spiritually powerful you are. So in this view, sacred space is sacralized by human actions and human behavior. Places become sacred because people treat them differently from ordinary spaces. There are other ways in which power is sensed as believers make spaces sacred. The placing of individuals like the king or the queen, the mayor, the wardens, the priest, the bishop, shows how much we reverence the power of individuals exercised in that particular space. On the left-hand side, you can clearly see that chair there, that pew, is not for anybody to sit in. Look at the top of it. It's very different from the surrounding pews. It has a mitre at the top of it, a cross, this elaborate carving by Grinling Gibbons. It's actually the bishop's throne or chair or pew in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. This doesn't just apply to ordained people in churches. On the right-hand side there, you can see church warden staves. The people's warden with a crown on the left, the bishop's warden on the right. These sticks, elaborate sticks, were situated on the aisle side of pews, about halfway down the nave of the church, where everybody could see them. They were used in processions by the church wardens, the people's warden and the bishop's warden. They were sometimes used to poke people awake, so it said, if they fell asleep during sermons. They were carried in front of the bishop to protect the bishop on a visit. So clearly they designate a certain power within a sacred space. In Eastern Orthodoxy, well, here's another example before we get on to that. Here's the mayor's pew in St. Peter's Church in Barnstaple, Devon. Historically, in fact, this is in the United Kingdom, the mayor of Barnstaple acted as the bailiff or the strong arm of the local feudal baron. And the pew here is flanked by the lion and the unicorn, and the chair back here bears the arms of the city of, or the town of Barnstaple. It's never succeeded in making itself recognized as a city. In the Greek Orthodox Church, the iconostasis separates the Holy of Holies from the congregation that is the other side of it. So here we can see the priests alone are allowed behind the iconostasis. The doors are opened at the procession of the gospel for the arrival of the host, the wine, also at Holy Communion. So this only allows a sort of restricted access to what the priest is doing behind the iconostasis until the doors are opened and the priest comes out. Whereas if you go to a Quaker meeting house, for instance, there's no division because the Quakers believe that there's no distinction between the gathered faithful and there's no distinction between a pew that is dedicated for a worshipper and a pew that is dedicated to the leader of worship, because there is none. So every pew is just as important as any other. Now, you can see from this that you can tell what people think about organizational structures in their religious group, their denomination, what they think about the priest or the presider, or even whether they think that divine power in that space is situational, or that is, it's been arranged by the people or the bishop, or if it's substantive, that is, God dwells there. You can tell what denominations think about that by the way in which the church itself has been organized. And we're going to discover that as we work through this series. Now we've looked at that a little bit, we're going to look a little bit at how cultural historians have sometimes sketched out the history of the West into these four broad categories that might help us to see how churches and religious spaces have been constructed through these chief periods of the evolution of of the way in which human societies have been organized. So cultural historians have sketched out this history in 4 broad categories, and here you can see it sociologically sketched out. 10,000 BC, there were bands of people that gathered together, that formed themselves into tribes, that then formed themselves under chiefs around 6,000 BC, and those chiefs eventually became powerful enough to collect various tribes and chiefdoms together to make states around 3000 BC in the great areas of the emergence of writing and human culture in the Yangtze River in China, in the Indus River in India, in the Tigris and the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, and in the Nile River and Delta in Egypt. They then organized themselves into city-states. Certain cities became extremely powerful, like Sumer, or in the case of Sumer, or the case of Memphis in Egypt. They then were agglomerated into great powers. They weren't quite empires yet, because they weren't self-consciously trying to defeat other great powers to form themselves into empires, like the first world empire, the Assyrian Empire in the Middle East around 700 BC. So as we look at this, we can see that historians have thought about these the ways in which human civilization have evolved in sociological terms, but we can also talk about it in cultural terms. First of all, we have what people have called primal culture. This begins about 1.5 million years ago, and it lasts until about 3000, 2000 BC. It's still around today in Amerindian, in Aboriginal, indigenous peoples' conceptions of sacred space all over the world. So we can see in primal culture, societies are tribal or arranged in chiefdoms, and the religious form is basically shamanistic. So space, time are thought of as these circular webs, and the divine is felt through creation primarily, and the cycles of nature make the divine visible. These primal cultures are usually polytheistic, that is to say they have several gods or several spiritual forces that are exercising themselves within certain spaces, and this passed into Christian religious spaces too, when the indigenous peoples of Europe were Christianized. And so we think of these sacred spaces of the Druids that were turned into Christian centres, groves of trees or holy wells. Here are a few examples of that. Here on the left-hand side, you can see St. Winifreda's Well in Holywell in Wales, sometimes referred to as the Lourdes of England. This was a sacred site well before the Christians arrived, and is still a great pilgrimage site today. On the right-hand side, we can see perhaps the more famous St. Bridget's Well in Kildare in Ireland, which was a sacred site to the indigenous peoples of Ireland before the arrival of Christianity with St. Patrick. Here you can see that it's actually quite common to find ancient yew trees in cemeteries in England and in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, perhaps because the churches with which they were associated were built on sites that were previously sacred to the Druids, their holy trees, their holy groves. Although it has to be said that not enough is known about Druidic religions in England before Christianity to be sure of this. Various reasons why people think that these ancient trees are in graveyards that predate Christianity, but we can't go into those reasons just now. Perhaps we'll explore them later on. Here we can see that the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is the national shrine of Mexico, was actually built very near a sacred site that was already sacred to the Aztecs' mother goddess, Tonantzin, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And here is a famous picture of her that's instantly recognizable. Next, we move on to classical culture. This begins about 3000 BC, a little bit later, perhaps 2500 BC. People were moving away from these strictly tribal or chiefdom societies to larger groups of people who were organized into states, and as we see later on, into empires. And at this period, monotheism began to replace polytheism. So God's transcendence was emphasized more than God's immanence in nature. And that had an impact on the way sacred space was envisioned. Here you can see St. Paul's outside the walls. And you can see that in this case, this is not a space that has been arranged in a circular fashion. It's been arranged in a very linear fashion. This period, writing was invented, and it enabled the birth of religions with a holy book. It also meant that teachings could be standardized over very large areas. So religious architecture was standardized over very large areas. This is an example of it. And leadership isn't any longer in the hands of these nature-rooted shamans, but in the hands of these temple-based priests. This is a Christian example of it, but Christians took over these sacred sites of the religions that preceded them and adapted them to Christian use. So these churches were built to reflect this uniform worship of God and the power of the priests to mediate it. Here we have the apse, the transept, the nave built for a procession, and an apse built for the enthronement of the person who was presiding over the religious ritual that was taking place in the space, as we can see here. Modern culture began around 1400 BC. These dates are very arbitrary, it has to be said, but in which this sort of sharp distinction between spirit and matter that we saw in classical culture began to be challenged by philosophers, and they emphasized a sort of return to this rootedness in the earth. It was also the time of the Protestant Reformation, as we'll see in a moment, and the Protestant Reformation tended to undermine those hierarchical structures that we saw in stone there in St. Paul's outside the walls. They challenged the authority of the Pope, of the priests, of the monks and the nuns to some extent, and put the power in the hands of individual human conscience. It was also the time of the scientific revolution, obviously, and the drive to figure out criteria to judge what was true, what was real or not. And this modern culture is characterized by a certain individualism, a fragmentation of society. It's no longer under one holy writ. It's now the province of specialists who are specialists in this or specialists in that or the other. And this resulted in modern culture in this loss of a holistic view of reality. And religion eventually became a private affair. And that's why we see in these churches this sort of thing developing. Individual box pews, a place where the reader sits. There's no longer a high altar that is the focus of this thing. It looks like a space that is more designed for individual worship, places where individual was prioritized over the general, over the mass. In postmodern culture, which we find emerging after the Second World War, we see a skepticism about everything, deconstruction. Some postmodern thinkers, thinking of Derrida and these others, they try and deconstruct everything that's gone before to say that your perception as an individual of what is real is all that matters. You can interpret things how you wish. Others, after this fragmentation, after this desire to return to this holistic view that we saw earlier expressed in primal societies and to some extent in classical societies where there was a homogeneity, there's a sort of longing for that return, and that has meant that a sort of radical orthodoxy has developed, trying to return to the fundamentals of the Christian faith, a return to symbols and myths and rituals that bring us back in some ways to primal culture. It's also far more relational than we saw in that picture of modern culture. Postmodern culture tends to emphasize the fact that we relate to each other. We communicate with each other, unfortunately, far too often through electronic devices, especially during the pandemic, as we saw, but that was something of a gift to us during that period. But postmodern culture has tried to have a return to this idea that we're all in it together. And therefore, that's going to affect the way in which the church architecture is being built in this postmodern era. And to conclude, here are just a couple of slides of that. Here we can see a church in the round, a very modern church. You may like it, you may dislike it, but here you can see it's not individual box pews. We still have an altar up here, but there's no altar rail around it. Clearly, it's a sacred space. It's elevated very slightly here in relationship to the bottom pews, but there's no altar rail that seems to be separating it off. We see the holy flowing out and flowing in as well at the same time, post-Vatican II church. And here's an example of a modern Roman Catholic church that shows us some of this longing to return to something that we call about orthodoxy, or the good old days of when churches looked like proper churches. And here you can see a high altar separated by a rail. We can see an apse. It seems to be a return in some ways to the picture that we saw earlier on of St. Paul's without the walls. Even from the outside, it looks like a modern construction, but it also looks very much like a revival of what Christian architecture used to look like. So our final point might be a little puzzle after we've looked at the ways in which societies have constructed these holy spaces through time. This is the puzzle. We're busy at the moment accommodating our lives to all of our contemporary conditions of postmodernism, technology, economics, sociology, and everything. But when we look at our churches, sometimes all we want is good old-fashioned classical religion, as we can see from these pictures. There's pictures here of this modern Roman Catholic church. We feel, some of us anyway, perhaps, that the church should always look the same. So how do we construct churches that affirm the goodness of creation that we saw in primal cultures, and the need for redemption in Christ, the sacredness of nature and the redemption of nature through Christ that Paul talks about? How do we make churches that show that God is present in creation, but also transcendent over all things? How do we build a church space that does recognize the distinct roles and the power positions in the church that we just explored, but also affirms the basic racial and sexual equality of all people, the equality between single people and married people, between young people and old people? How can we create a holy space that does that? So perhaps it's hardly surprising that there are so many different kinds of church in existence, and we're going to be looking at that in the next few sessions. So that's about it for now. In our next video, we're going to be exploring some of the vocabulary that is used to describe sacred spaces in Christianity: cathedral, basilica, temple, church, shrine. And we're going to do a little quiz on whether or not we can spot whether a church is a church or something else. Until then, I'm going to say cheerio for now, and hope you can join us for the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.